He was a man who had spent half his life in silence, a loner rancher, forgotten by the world, with nothing but the howl of coyotes and the echo of his own footsteps to remind him he was still alive. Each day was the same: endless fields, empty nights, a cabin where no laughter had ever lingered, but deep inside, his heart begged for something more. Out of desperation, he wrote a letter for a bride he had never met, hoping it might fill the hollow place that loneliness had carved into him. And then, after months of waiting, the wagon finally rolled in. His wait was over. His chest tightened as the door creaked open, and his heart thundered with hope. But what stepped down was not what he imagined, not the delicate figure he had prayed for, not the fragile soul he thought he'd protect. Instead, a woman twice his size, with eyes like storms and a satchel she clutched as though it held her very life. In that single moment, his heart stopped. His world would never be the same again. The ranch sat on the edge of the endless plains, where silence ruled the nights and only the whisper of wind filled the days. For years, Elias Kincaid had lived there alone. His only company, the creak of the barn door and the mournful cry of coyotes. He was known in town as the loner rancher, a man who kept to himself, never seeking company, never asking for help. But behind his silence was a weight only he carried. His heart had grown tired of empty mornings, of meals eaten alone, of evenings where he stared across the horizon with no one waiting by the fire. He had spent years working the land, but land could not warm the soul. It was loneliness that gnawed at him more than hunger ever could. One winter night, when the cold seemed to seep into his very bones, Elias wrote a letter that would change everything. He sent for a mail-order bride, a stranger who might bring life back into the hollow silence of his home. For weeks, he waited. Each day stretched longer than the last, and every passing wagon on the trail made him rise, only to return to his chair when no one came. Hope became a cruel companion, one that teased but never gave. Still, he held on. He cleaned the cabin as though preparing for a queen, laid out fresh linens, and even polished the iron stove until it gleamed. Each sunrise, he told himself, maybe today, the townsfolk whispered. Some mocked him, saying no woman would ever come. For a man like Elias, a man with scars across his hands, a face weathered by sun and solitude, and eyes that seemed to hold storms within them, others pitied him, calling him a broken soul chasing an impossible dream. But Elias paid them no mind. He had written the letter, and he believed in the promise it carried. Then came the day the wagon was due. Elias rose before dawn, his heart pounding harder than it had in years. He dressed in his best, though best for him was a clean shirt, mended trousers, and boots polished until the leather shone faintly in the morning light. He saddled his horse and rode to the station, each hoofbeat echoing the rhythm of his own restless heart. The closer he got, the more his hands trembled. What if she never stepped off? What if his wait ended not with joy, but with another cruel silence? He tried to steady himself, telling his soul not to hope too much, but hope burned anyway. The wagon rolled in, dust curling into the air. Men greeted their wives, children ran, 2 mothers, and families embraced. Elias stood apart, his eyes locked on the door of that wagon. One woman stepped down, then another. None were his. Minutes felt like hours, and then she appeared. But what Elias saw made his breath catch in his throat. She was not the delicate figure he had imagined from the letters, not the fragile companion his mind had built. She was taller than him, broad-shouldered, her frame carrying twice the weight he expected. Her hands, large and calloused, clutched a worn satchel. Her dress strained at the seams, her bonnet shadowed her face, but when she lifted her eyes, there was a strength in them that struck him like thunder. For a moment, Elias's world went still. He had imagined someone he could shield, someone who would lean on him. Instead, here stood a woman who looked as though she had carried burdens heavier than his own. His heart stopped, not from disappointment, not from fear, but from the sheer shock of seeing a future he never envisioned standing before him. The townsfolk noticed. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Some laughed softly, others exchanged glances, and a few shook their heads. To them, it was a cruel joke that the loner rancher who dreamed of a gentle bride had been given someone who dwarfed him in size. But Elias didn't hear their laughter. His eyes were fixed on her, and a storm of questions roared inside him. Who was she, really? Why had she come? And why, in the moment she looked back at him, did his chest feel like it might shatter? He stepped forward slowly, his boots pressing into the dust. She stood there, unflinching, her face unreadable. The silence between them was heavier than any words could be. Elias's heart hammered. This was not what he expected, not what he prepared for. And yet, something deep within whispered that destiny often arrives in ways we cannot imagine. He reached for her satchel, offering to carry it, but she pulled it closer, as though guarding something within. Her grip was iron, her stance unwavering. For the first time in years, Elias felt small not in body, but in spirit. He wondered if the woman before him carried secrets far heavier than the satchel itself. As the wagon pulled away, leaving them, standing alone, the dust settled around their feet. The rancher who had waited so long now faced a truth he could not have written in any letter. His wait had ended, but in a way that shook every certainty he held. And though his heart had stopped in shock, it now began to beat with a different rhythm of questions, of fear, and of a strange, unspoken pull toward the towering woman who would soon step into his home, and perhaps into the deepest corners of his life. He guided her toward the horse, unsure if she would even mount it. But she did, with a strength that startled him. As they rode back across the plains, the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of fire and ash. Elias glanced at her from the corner of his eye, watching the way she scanned the horizon, as if searching for something long lost. He wondered if she was as reluctant as he felt, or if, beneath that stoic gaze, there lay a story far more heartbreaking than his own. That night, as they reached the cabin, Elias opened the door and motioned her inside. She stepped across the threshold, her presence filling the small space like a tide rising in silence. The fire crackled, shadows danced, and Elias felt the weight of his solitude colliding with the unknown force she brought. His life had been one of waiting. Now, the wait was over, but what it had delivered might change him forever. The cabin door shut with a soft thud, and silence pressed in. Elias stood just inside, unsure what to do next. For years, he had dreamed of this moment, the day his wait for companionship would end. Yet standing across from the woman who now filled his small home, he felt more like a stranger in his own skin than ever before. She set her satchel down by the wall, but kept one hand resting firmly on it, as though it contained her very life. Her eyes roamed the cabin, taking in the rough-hewn table, the neatly swept floor, the fire crackling in the hearth. There was no flicker of surprise, no trace of relief, only a steady, unreadable calm, the kind Elias had only seen in men hardened by war. Elias cleared his throat, but words refused to come. His loneliness had driven him to send for a bride, yet now, face to face with her, he realized he had no script for this meeting. He had not expected her size, her strength, or the intensity in her gaze. His hands fidgeted at his sides, rough and scarred, as though searching for something to hold. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was low, firm, and carried a weight that made Elias's chest tighten. "This place," she said slowly. "It's quiet." Elias nodded, swallowing hard. "It's been quiet too long." The fire popped, filling the silence that followed. He motioned toward the chair by the table, but she remained standing, towering over the small space. The air between them was thick, not with comfort, but with something unspoken, something that pressed harder than loneliness ever had. As the evening stretched on, Elias cooked beans and bread, offering her a plate. She accepted, but ate in silence, her movements deliberate, her eyes fixed not on him, but on the flames. He watched her, every bite she took seeming like a puzzle piece he couldn't place. Who was she, really? What had life carved into her, to make her this way? When the plates were empty, she finally looked at him directly. Her gaze was steady, unyielding. "You expected someone else," she said flatly, as if reading the thought he had buried deep. Elias froze. He wanted to deny it, but the truth hung too heavy. His silence was answer enough. She leaned back slightly, her eyes never leaving his. "I know what they think in town. I've heard laughter before, I've seen the stares. Men expect a delicate flower, they don't expect me." Her words struck like a blade. Elias felt the shame rise in him, not because she accused him, but because she was right. He had imagined someone fragile, someone who would fill his loneliness with softness. Instead, this woman radiated a strength that unsettled him. And yet, beneath her words, he caught something else, a trace of pain, of a wound long hidden. That night, Elias lay awake in the narrow bed he had prepared, while she slept on the cot he had hastily set in the corner. But he doubted she slept. Her breathing was steady, but her hand never strayed far from the satchel by her side. He stared at the ceiling, his mind unraveling. His heart had stopped in shock when she stepped from the wagon, but now it raced with questions he had no answers for. The days that followed tested him in ways he never expected. She was not helpless. She carried firewood with ease, hauled water without complaint, and fixed the barn door before he could fetch his tools. She worked as though she had lived on land like this her whole life, though there was a harshness in the way she moved as if every task was a battle she was determined to win. Elias tried to speak with her, to draw out even a piece of her story, but she gave little. Her words were few, her eyes guarded. She offered no past, no reason for coming, only silence, broken by the strength of her hands that left no chore undone. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Elias found her standing at the edge of the field, her bonnet removed, her hair loose against the wind. She looked not at the land, but at the faraway hills, as though searching for something or someone lost beyond reach. He stepped closer, his voice low. "What brought you here?" She didn't turn. "The same thing that brought you to write that letter," she answered softly. "An ending, and maybe a beginning." Her words sank deep into him. He realized then that she carried her own weight, her own silence, perhaps far heavier than his. The satchel she guarded day and night, what secrets did it hold? What truths could be so precious, so painful, that she would rather carry them to her grave than share them with the man she was now bound to? As the nights grew colder, the distance between them remained. Yet Elias began to notice small cracks in her armor, a sigh she tried to hide by the fire, the way her hand lingered on the frame of the cabin door, as if longing for a world beyond, the faint tremor in her voice when she asked about the hills. These glimpses made his chest tighten, stirring something more powerful than shock-compassion. And then, one night, the silence broke. A storm raged outside, winds clawing at the cabin walls. She sat by the fire, clutching the satchel tight, her knuckles white. Elias approached carefully, the storm's howl drowning the sound of his boots. She lifted her eyes, and for the first time, he saw fear flicker there. "I didn't come here just to be a wife," she whispered. "I came because I had no place left to go." Her voice trembled. Her grip on the satchel tightened. Elias waited, his heart pounding like the storm outside. She opened the worn bag slowly, her hands shaking, and drew out a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a small child's dress, tattered and faded, pressed flat from years of being kept hidden. She held it as though it were a living thing, her shoulders trembling as tears filled her eyes. Her voice broke. "This is all I have left of her." Elias's breath caught. The woman who seemed unbreakable, who towered over him and carried burdens with ease, now wept quietly before him. He realized then that her size, her strength, her silence, they were not walls built to keep others out, but shields to survive a world that had taken too much from her already. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin, something shifted. Elias felt his own loneliness collide with her grief, binding them in a way no letter ever could. His heart had stopped when she stepped from the wagon, but now it beat with a new, painful clarity. This woman was not the bride he imagined. She was something greater, something more terrifying, something far more human. And as he watched her cradle the small dress against her chest, Elias knew that his life was no longer his alone. Her past had walked into his cabin, and her secrets would test the strength of both their souls. The wait had ended, but the true story had only just begun. The storm passed, leaving the plains washed in silence. Dawn broke gray and heavy, the air damp with the scent of rain. Elias stepped outside, the ground soft beneath his boots, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man standing alone against the world. Inside that cabin was a woman, who carried grief like armor, and somehow her pain had begun to mirror his own. When he returned, she was still by the fire, the child's dress folded neatly back into the satchel. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed with red, but her shoulders were straighter as though the weight she carried had shifted, if only slightly. Elias sat across from her, the silence stretching between them. Yet now, it was no longer the silence of strangers, but of two souls bound by wounds too deep for words. Days turned into weeks. The rhythm of ranch life carried on, chores, long rides across the fields, nights by the fire, but something had changed. She still spoke little, yet when she looked at him, Elias no longer saw only walls. He saw flickers of trust, fragile, but real. One evening, as the sun sank in a blaze of gold, she stood beside him in the field. Her voice was soft, almost lost to the wind. Her name was Clara, my daughter. She didn't survive the fever. After she passed, the world stopped making sense. I had nowhere left to go, until your letter came. Ilias's chest tightened. He had thought himself broken by solitude, but her loss was a wound deeper than any he could imagine. He wanted to speak, to offer comfort, but no words seemed enough. Instead, he simply stood beside her, letting the silence hold what neither of them could say. That night, as the firelight flickered across her face, she turned to him. You thought you were waiting for a bride, but what stepped off that wagon was a woman carrying ghosts. Elias met her eyes, steady now, no longer afraid of the truth. Maybe I wasn't waiting for a bride, he said quietly. Maybe I was waiting for you. Her gaze lingered on him, searching, testing, as if trying to see if his words carried weight. Slowly, she let out a breath, the faintest crack of a smile tugging at her lips. It wasn't joy, it was something more fragile, more human, hope. And in that moment, Elias realized his heart hadn't stopped that day, out of shock alone. It had stopped because fate had shattered his expectations and handed him something far greater. Not the delicate companion he imagined, but a woman carved by grief, stronger than any storm, carrying a love so fierce it had nearly destroyed her. The loner rancher who had waited so long for his life to begin, now knew the truth. Life doesn't arrive as we picture it. It comes in unexpected forms, wrapped in sorrow, bound in secrets, yet carrying the power to heal what we thought was beyond repair. As the fire dimmed and the plains outside settled into quiet once more, Elias looked at her not as the woman, twice his size, not as the stranger who had stepped from the wagon, but as the one soul who had ended his wait, not with perfection, but with the truth. And for the first time in years, he no longer felt alone. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to give it a like. It truly helps more people discover it. Subscribe to Legacy Ignited so you never miss the next powerful story that might change the way you see the world. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And from the bottom of my heart, thank you for watching and being part of this journey.